Welcome to Grappling with a Gray, a forum for promoting the development of an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Jonathan Goldson, and I'd like to welcome my guests. Byron Edgington is a retired commercial and military helicopter pilot and co-author of Journey Well, You Are More Than Enough, written in collaboration with his wife, Mariah, and I think that's going to come out next week. Is that right, Byron?
Yes, again, using your phrase, with a little help from above. Yes, we are on track to come out. In fact, the unofficial launch date is the 20th of this month. So,
wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. Well, much success to you. Thank you for being here. Diane Good. Did I get that right?
You did, Jonathan.
Oh, good. Diane is a singular RN, JD storyteller, and global podcaster, guiding professional wisdom to the heart of their message so they are seen, heard, understood, and listened to. She is also the founder of Engaged Storyism Method. Diane, thank you for being here. And Scott Mason is a master of mythology, transformational coach, and professional speaker who helps executives and successful entrepreneurs find professional freedom by dislodging toxic myths, holding them back, and igniting their charisma within. And I just a couple of hours ago heard a quote from Carl Jung who said the most important question to ask yourself is what myth you are living. So, Scott, welcome. Thank you for being here. And let us proceed to today's ethical scenario. True story. About 20 years ago, maybe a little longer, I was applying for life insurance. The first question on the application form asked, have you ever gone skydiving? Well, I had gone skydiving, but that was back when I was a reckless sophomore in college. I had no intention of ever jumping out of a plane again for fun. So I asked myself, what should I do? Should I tell the truth and risk damaging my eligibility or incurring higher premiums? Or should I give a more accurate impression of who I am now by lying? The floor is open.
I'll start.
Please.
You know, one of the things I liked about this question is that it really took a dart and threw it right at the hole of or the bullseye of a common reactive position that people take when it comes to discussing ethics, which is that you always have to tell the truth. You have to, as a moral matter. And the argument that I've heard made around this is that truth is more pro-social, and therefore it builds the community. It ultimately is easier to keep up with than lying. And we always make a sort of moral dissent anytime we tell a lie, even if we believe there is a greater good being served. In this case, I don't know that there would be a greater good being served except the greater good of saving your personal money. That being said, what you hinted at in the way you framed the question was that what was really being asked was not necessarily the literal truth. And it's pretty transparent when you take these tests, or at least it may be pretty transparent to anyone who thinks they understand why these questions are being asked, that they're attempting to determine what level of a risk taker you are, or what level of risks you've taken, and then make some sort of actuarial determination based on that. And so reading that, if you feel as though lying would lead to a more accurate outcome, then you are actually, at least arguably, making a moral decision, or at least a morally defensible decision, by lying. The problem I have with that is that we think we know why the question's being asked. We think we know the interplay that it may or may not have with other questions. We think we know what whoever is assessing this test will believe, how it will be scored, but we have no actual proof, number one. Number two, as I hinted at earlier, Self-interest is the primary motivator here, not the larger interest of the pool of people that are applying for insurance, which is the entire group of stakeholders involved. And so answering one way or another here, particularly in a dishonest way, has some hidden risks from a larger social standpoint. Because if everyone is operating that way, then we have a situation in which an insurance application is being submitted into a larger pool that is itself price distorted because of ongoing variations from.
And I think you've really touched on a number of critical issues, Scott. That there's the question, there's the meta questions, we would say today, and then there's my own personal bias that may be skewing my objectivity. So Diane or Byron, you want to weigh in at this point?
I'm curious about the question posed in the scenario, which is, should I lie to give a more accurate impression of who I am now? Are you a liar now? Or are you not a skydiver now? It was just something that made me stop and think. The insurance company, and see, this is the other thing that's going to make it a little bit weird. 20 years ago, insurance companies might have looked disfavorably on skydiving. But we've had former presidents who've gone skydiving. And it's become more of a hobby than an exotic risk-taking adventure. So am I answering the question as it was posed 20 years ago? Or am I answering the questions as it might be posed today? Because if I look at it today, then there have been changes in the attitudes of society. There have been changes in the attitudes of insurance companies. If somebody doesn't want to insure you because they think that skydiving is not an insurable risk, well, there's probably somebody next door who will. So if you could clarify for us, what period of time are we really looking at?
Well, you're touching on one of the topics that I come back to again and again. There's this phrase that I find particularly insidious, situational ethics. And the way it's used is to mean that you change the situation and the ethics change, which I think is extremely dangerous.
Well, in this case, they might. Not the
What I would
ethics.
say instead is that ethical principles don't change, situations do.
Yes.
And that you have to apply the principles to the specific situations. Then that's why ethics is, so that's why we grapple with the gray. When it's black and white, it's pretty straightforward. When it's gray and murky, so we have to get into these types of prioritizing and competing values. But your point is absolutely correct, that the way of interpreting the situation 20 years ago may not be the way to interpret the situation now, not because ethics is different, but because the times are.
I mean, the times are wildly different. So
Well, yeah.
if you're faced with, have you ever gone skydiving? And you don't want to reach out to the company and say, do you mean in the past year, the past 3 years, the past 5 years, or ask or check a yes, and then say, but that was in my frivolous youth and I've not done it ever since then. So the question becomes a matter of who's willing to support your habit in that sense. Who can you go to that would have the opportunity to insure you, albeit at a higher premium, perhaps? And I'll leave it right there for now.
Byron?
Well, there's all kinds of ways you can look at this. And I guess without any other context to the question and not knowing how you responded, the one thing that occurs to me that, as Scott said, why are they asking this question? I think obviously they're trying to figure out what kind of a person you are. It has a lot more to do with your comfort level with risk than anything to do with skydiving. But it's strange to me that an insurance company, and these folks are in the actuarial business. That's what they do. It's how they make the nut, if you will. They know the actuarial aspect of everything. And I can make a pretty good argument that skydiving is a lot safer than driving to work every day. And so it obviously has nothing to do with skydiving. Having said that, you know, we always hear it's never good to lie. Okay, but what, you know, how far do we take that? The situation is different now. One of the things I think that I'd have to know, if speaking of context, I'd have to know what some of the other questions on the application were. I don't. So it's really difficult to arrive. And maybe that's the key to it. What would happen? You have to ask yourself these many years later, what would happen if you just didn't answer the question? I don't know.
You know, that's very
You know,
interesting. That is not an option that I considered at the time.
Well,
Leaving the box
you know,
blank. That's very
leave it
interesting.
blank. And does that tell the company that you failed to answer it? Does it tell them that you'd rather not? In any case, I think there are several different ways to look at it, but again, I'd have to know some of the other questions.
Well,
But,
let me fill in a little bit.
yeah,
I believe that I understood the intent of the company, which is, as you say, Byron, is this somebody who is going to be taking risks that we may have to pay for? And if so, that may figure into the premiums that
Sure,
we charge.
sure.
And I think that's entirely reasonable. The company I ended up going with, the question on their form was, have you been skydiving in the last 10 years?
There you go.
And I think that I'd like to get into that. I know, Scott, you have something you want to add, but I'd like to get into the discussion of the phrasing of the question, I think is also an ethical issue. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, that's actually related to what I wanted to say, which is the phrasing of the original question and the assumptions that were made about why it was asked go, at least from my perspective, as to the risks associated with making assumptions around motivations and then making ethical decisions around assumptions. Because really, what if the question was placed there to see if you would lie? What if there were a bunch of other ways in which they were asking similar risk-oriented questions, and then they throw something out there that seems like it invites controversy to see how you'll respond, compare it against the other questions, and then say this person isn't honest. They should be rejected because they have an integrity issue and they may be, reporting fraudulent claims to us or whatever. The more clear question allows a smaller room for us to be able to make determinations about intent, and I think therefore makes the ethical decision a little bit easier. But it's always our ethical decision to determine whether we're going to let our assumption about what someone else is thinking guide our own ethical behavior.
And to add on to that, Scott, you might be onto something. Maybe they already knew the answer somehow, and they wanted to see if you would answer it the way they expected. Who knows?
Well, you can what if this all day.
Sure.
I mean, have you gone skydiving in the past year, the past 5 years, the past 10 years? Have you gone scuba diving? Have you fill in the blank? And we know something you don't know. You could go down this rat hole of the what ifing assumptions until the cows came home, which does not get you away from your obligation to answer the question as directly as you can. The reason that they call insurance fraud is because it's a lie. It's perpetrated on a company and you're trying to benefit from the lie. At the end of the day, the people who are going to get hurt are not necessarily you. Let's say that you managed to skate through the probationary period, you managed to skate through the first 2 years of, or whatever the timeline is that the company says, we're going to keep an eye on you. You skate through all that and nobody calls you on your lie. But you come up against a year later, you die, your loved ones file a claim and it's denied because what are the chances? It's come out that you've lied on the form. And so what you're doing now by saving a bit of coin is harming the beneficiaries of that claim, which are probably your loved ones. And depending on what state you live in, if you're still alive and they figure out the claim is fraud or the information is fraudulent, you're looking at not a misdemeanor, but a felony. And depending on the state, it could be a Class C felony. So my question to the applicant is, how lucky do you feel?
Well, if I could. That being said, going back to something that I think I mentioned earlier, and I would love for us to ponder, is to what extent then is and I'm hearing this a little bit in some of the background discourse, including my own statements, the concept that lying is inherently an ethical evil, actually even a correct one. And although my reflexive answer to something you raised, Jonasson, earlier about situational ethics being problematic, let's look at another related example. Let's say I was associated with ISIS or Al-Qaeda, and I somehow got access to the US Embassy and asked, are you going to drop a nuclear bomb on our headquarters in 2 days like I've heard? Now, if lying is an absolute ethical no-no, presumably then if it was true, a US official would say, oh, well, we're not gonna lie. Yes, we're going to, giving them a chance to escape. Not only that though, but if we're making assumptions about motivations, what if the reason that the person was asking was because for whatever reason, if they knew that was the case, they might have been an informant for Al-Qaeda or ISIS and told you in response, well, they're moving in 2 days, so you'll be bombing a bunch of nothing. Bomb tomorrow. And so thinking again about situational ethics, a situational ethic that we're talking about almost implicitly is that in the given scenario is that lying on an insurance application is bad, but lying to not let Al-Qaeda know that we're about to bomb them tomorrow might be good. That's situational ethics in action.
I disagree. I don't see that. I disagree with that position, because now we've gone from extra premiums for a life insurance policy to a nuclear bomb in the wrong hands. So I'm not saying that it is inherently wrong to lie. I'm looking at the situation. And in this particular situation, what has been posed is, should I tell the truth and risk damaging my eligibility or incurring higher premiums? It's very self-serving. We don't know how much higher premiums. Is it $1 or can you find another company? Or should I not lie because I don't want to risk what could happen if that lie is found out? So I'm saying that the basis on which that decision is being made as it's presented to us, I won't get the policy and I have to pay a little bit more if I do, doesn't stack up against, I've got a nuclear bomb and I'm holding you hostage with that because of terrorism. I don't see the two things being equally weighted.
How do we know where exactly the weight changes?
Byron?
Well, I was just going to say, Diane is you have a background as an attorney, of course. And so at some point, we could get off in the weeds and say, well, what does skydiving mean? What's the definition of skydiving?
Or inhale.
Yeah. Yeah, but we won't do that. We'll just assume that everybody's talking the same language here. But even so, sometimes it does benefit us to define the terms. Maybe that's just something that Jonasson did one time with that intention of only doing it one time. Doesn't make him a skydiver. I think you referred to this earlier.
Well, this is a part of the question. There's a concept called a white mutiny, where let's say soldiers who feel that their superiors are not competent will not refuse to carry out orders, but will carry them out so literally that they actually intentionally misconstrue the intent of the order. So, the Amelia Bedelia type of thing, draw the drapes, and here's a nice picture of the drapes.
Yeah.
We can manipulate language in a way to make it serve us rather than serve objective meaning. And that's also a manipulation. That's also playing with the truth. In Jewish philosophy, the Hebrew word emes, which translates as truth, actually means something that's more nuanced than that. It really means the meta truth. So for instance, if I'm standing on a street corner and a fellow comes running down the street and makes a quick left turn and takes off, and another guy comes after him holding a knife and says, "Which way did that guy go?" What should I do? Should I be factually accurate? Say, "Oh, he went that way." Should I be factually inaccurate and say, "No, he went the other way"? Am I allowed to lie? Or in a metaphysical sense, is it not lying because it's serving the greater truth of protecting a life?
But
Now, from a theological point of view, that's easy to understand the concept. In a practical application, it's much more complicated because, as we already said, once we open that door, now all of our rationalizations and all our biases and all our predilections will allow us to manipulate truth whenever we think it's serving a higher purpose. Yeah, Diane.
But I don't see what life you're saving here. According to your scenario, it's self-serving. I want to be eligible for this particular policy. Who knows? If there are other policies, other companies, who knows? I don't know. And so I can't speculate about that. I don't have personal knowledge of the research that you've done. But it goes back to, should I tell the truth and risk damaging my eligibility or incurring higher premiums? Where's the meta truth there? Unless one is asking that question and saying, if I get away with this, then I can get away with something else. And if I can get away with cheating the system and perhaps cheating the beneficiaries who are relying on me to have a life insurance policy in place for them, where else can I cheat?
You're really making 2 points. One second, Scott. You're making 2 points, Diane, and they're both valid points. One is, can we compare 2 cases when the consequences, going back to Scott's case of the nuclear bomb, is there a universal ethical principle of truth that changes depending on the consequences? Mass destruction versus my own insurance premiums? Or is there something more nuanced going on there? And then there's the other element that you're mentioning, which is, once I tell a small lie, it's so easy to tell another lie, a bigger lie, and now we're off down the famous proverbial slope. So, yeah, Scott.
I would disagree with Diane in one other respect, which is that it's not just about our premium. I would argue that any time we are engaging in a social interaction, and by the way, we engage in social interactions a lot more than sometimes we're willing to face, that there is a meta issue involved. It's not just about you and your premium, because other premiums are impacted by the amount that you pay, as well as the solvency of that company potentially. Again, we don't know what the financial condition of that company is. We don't know what it's going to face tomorrow. A life could be at stake if, for whatever reason, that lie that you told was the one last thing that broke the camel's back financially for that insurance company, and then someone needed the coverage from that insurance and wasn't able to get it. So I would actually err on the side of saying that, to the extent that you were talking, Jonathan, earlier about meta truth versus the factual truth, the questions around meta truth always exist when social engagement is a part of the equation.
I don't disagree with that. And I see your point. And at the same time, I'm also going back to the scenario, which makes it very personal. Should I tell the truth, risk my eligibility, incur a higher premium for me? This guy isn't talking about the rest of the world. He's not talking about the rest of the insureds. He's looking at it very self-servingly. And that's what I was focusing on. I agree with you that whenever we're in community, even if whenever we are in community, there is that tacit acknowledgement that what we do is done on behalf of ourselves and also on community. So if we're going to drive through a neighborhood in excess of the speed limit because we want to get somewhere fast, we run the risk that some little kid is going to run out in the middle of the street chasing a ball. It says 25 miles an hour for a reason. So I see that. But this scenario doesn't posit that he's not thinking of the way I'm reading it. The way I'm reading it is, I did some skydiving. I want a life insurance policy. This question is asking me if I ever did it before. If I tell the truth, I have to pay more. If I lie, maybe I can skate through. And that's the difficult part for me here, because it's, to me, as I'm reading it, it is phrased as so self-serving. There isn't a thought about the future. There isn't a thought about what if I'm hauled away in cufflinks because of fraud? What if my family who's relying on me to have a life insurance policy is denied that? What if?
Well,
Yeah,
I think that I think we're actually just about to the end of our time. So I'm going to ask each of you to sum up in about a minute and take a minute each. But to your point, Diane, I think that, you know, the what was going through my mind is that the question was not a fair question. The question should have asked me, am I a skydiver? And this is why I ended up not submitting the policy, because I didn't want to lie, but I didn't feel that the question allowed me to be fully truthful. And so I think that the truth comes from two different directions. It's the situations that we create for others can put them in positions where they feel they have to compromise their values. And that puts a responsibility on all of us in our interactions. It goes back to Scott's point of the personal interactions. At the same time, particularly the point that you keep coming back to, Diane, is that it seems self-serving. I think we always have to be suspicious of our own self-interest. And then whenever self-interest is in play, we have to be doubly, triply careful that we're not rationalizing. And one of the ways we do that is by asking objective parties who are not emotionally involved, because then we can get a bit of clarity that we might never be able to get on our own. So if you could each take about a minute, some of your final thoughts. Byron, can I ask you to start?
Me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess here's another scenario that just occurred to me. Speaking of the meta aspect of this, it could be that they would be more inclined to give you the policy if you answered it honestly and said yes, because they want to know that you, and this is a sorry state if we have come to this, if they want to know if you're honest or if you're risking enough to tell the truth, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. You know, maybe they want to know if we have arrived at a point where telling the truth incurs a greater risk than lying. And so maybe that's another question for another day.
But of course, then if I never did go skydiving, then I'll be penalized for marking it no.
Yeah. So.
Okay, well, thank you. Diane? Last thoughts?
Well, having gone skydiving, I can see where you are kind of signing your life away, and probably should say as much on the form. And so the way I would have addressed this is yes, but. I would have found that, check it off, and then you add that sentence in there, which would be in line with what Byron was saying. Yes, but it was 20 years ago. I've never done it since, and I have no intention of doing it again. And so that's probably the way I would handle it, because the looming possibilities of being caught weigh against the lie.
Thank you. Scott, you get the last word.
The tip of an iceberg can look like a simple white triangle. Nonetheless, what lays beneath the ocean is complex, huge, and multidimensional. This question was the white triangle on the top of an iceberg. I love beginning to explore what the rest of the iceberg looked like underneath the water.
And
Well
that's a really a wonderful way to wrap this up. And thank you for that.
Yeah.
We had a little technical difficulty, so I can't thank my guests in person right now, but thank you to Byron, thank you to Diane, and thank you to Scott for a wonderful and lively conversation. And I do hope that they will join us again. If you'd like to submit an ethical scenario or dilemma for us to discuss, please go to my website, jonasandgoldson.com, and use the contact box or the contact information to send your suggestion. If it's something that we find is worth talking about, we will definitely put it on the program. If you are a Grappling with the Gray member, please use the community link to participate in a follow-up Q&A and continued discussion. If you're not a member, please go to gwtg.live. That's gwtg.live, where you can sign up for a free 30-day trial and enjoy member benefits. Please join us again next week for another ethical discussion as our panel grapples with the gray.